Here's the tree of knowledge insight. This is the actual drawing. I am stoned in my kitchen, okay, in 1997. I have this whole idea at the time called justification idea, justification theory, which you can see is this is what these little words mean.
Yep.
Justification theory. And the justification theory is the thing that differentiates us from the primate world. We split off from the primate world.
You said you had felt the overmind and light from supermind?
Yeah. The Ken Wilber experience would be what I was like, a wisdom energy. Energy is down and back to Big Bang and wisdom's up to God. I experienced a wisdom energy alignment across the stack so that I was in touch with God as I was in touch with Big Bang, and my psyche was fundamentally, and down to my cells, were fundamentally aligned and singing the same song. I had this like a 2-week period of transcendent wisdom energy. And I was just wandering around going like, dude, yep, this is the way it should be.
When was it? What did it feel like?
I interpret this as quantum field theory and Big Bang telling us there's what I call an energy information implicate order underneath the material dimension of complexity. What no one can claim is that the universe goes into tiny, tiny material billiard balls. We know that's 100% not true, but that's the ontology of the time. So everything is materialistically based, and we know actually radiation, quantum fields, Big Bang, energy, whatever we're gonna, it's a tough term to define, but I call it energy information. That resides underneath the standard classical matter in motion world, okay? That's important because actually if the world is much more like energy information than it is billiard balls, when we get to mind, energy information is gonna be a lot closer to the concept of mind, okay, than billiard balls is. And I don't mean this meanly or personally to anybody, it's just like the institution doesn't know what to do with that.
You put up a mirror to psychology.
Right.
And psychology didn't like what it saw.
Well, it already repressed the idea that you could ever answer this question, and that it answered this question and said your empirical methods, which was going to be your salve here, is this actually a rationalization? And all this time when you're trying to do physics is you're clapping with one fucking hand, and you're generating all this information but not cumulative knowledge, and you know that to be true in your heart. Okay, well, people, that's a little threatening. Out of matter comes life, and then out of life comes mind, and then out of mind comes culture. And each one of these things, these big dimensional shifts, is a function of what? Information processing and communication networks.
Sure.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So you get cell on cell, and you get DNA, RNA as informational structures, okay, and cells communicate clearly with each other. And then you get animals with a brain. So the brain is like the DNA, RNA, only at a macro level, pulling cells together. It's an information processing system, and animals are communicate prey, predation, reproduction, all that. They're communicating with each other. So you get, and probably at the Cambrian explosion, what happened is prey predation is probably the big driver. It's like, oh, I can eat things other than plants. I'll eat other animals. And then other people are like, animals are like, no. And so now you got eating as the fundamental driver of complex active bodies with brains and warfare, basically pincers and detectors and all of the stuff that animals do as they jump around. But the information processing, nervous system, communication, animal on animal, sensory motor, dancing, okay? And plants communicate. Don't get me wrong. Plants have a lot of intelligence. Don't get me wrong. But they don't have sensory motor looping intelligence, and that's another layer on top of the truth. But really, all the relevant human truths and everything that you say this means is all embedded in a power-based system of justification. And then I got educated that, this whole Western Enlightenment thing wasn't just necessarily about scientific truths. It was about domination. It was about alienation. It was about marginalization. Let's look at women. How have they been since we went from hunter-gatherers, when they're pretty equal, into traditional societies where men then dominate the crap out of them for 5,000 years. Is that cool? No. And then I go back to my 4 sons and my dad, and then look at my mom and like, geez, it's like, I thought this was fair and maybe not. So what does that mean? It's like the systems of collective justification are shaped by people in power, biased toward the in-group. It's a miracle, okay? But sure. Postmodernism essentially affords us that insight in many ways, and then all of its ramification. Metamodern, so then you have the thesis that we can use science, and then you have the postmodern thesis, which is an antithesis. It just critiques it. No, you can't gain outside of cultural context. There's no grand position from nowhere. There's no grand meta-narrative. Metamodern says, actually, both of those things are synthetically true in relation, or you can build a frame that are synthetically true in relation, okay? and it's a sincere modernist in the sense of really telling you. Ironic, hey, it isn't a position that we're all bullshitters, I'll tell you that. So I'm a justifying ape that actually tells you I have keys to the universe. Hey, huh? Starting with the fact that I'm a justifying ape. Right? And indeed, that feeds back on postmodern. It's like, well, you are making the claim that we're justifiers. That's actually an ontological claim. I'm now at a place that I can place that ontology inside of the natural universe. That's the tree of knowledge, and that's the insight that I'll share right here. But the bottom line is that basically creates a network gestalt of associative adjacent identities that tie together physics, aesthetics and value, subjective, objective, nominal, and deductive claims, all into a network architecture that pops like a gestalt. And then the final thing that I did, okay, which is exactly 5 years to go, relates directly to this. I'll tell you exactly. This is a 5-year anniversary.
My goodness.
Okay, today.
What?
Is the emergence of the I-quad coin. Okay, and the I-quad coin then is the referent for the specific, unique, qualitative knower. So now you have an entire field network of justification that includes the pro and anti, all networked together with subjective, objective, logic, nominal, and all the various truth claims, okay, together, tied together in a coherent, I told you about coherence, a coherent system that places the parts in relationship to the whole, that takes the noise and turns it into music.
Wow. Well, I need time with that one,
so,
to be honest.
So there you go. That's fine. The I-quad path, I'll finalize it here. So 5 years ago to this day, at noon, I finished my I-quad path. Okay, I went out and kicked my son's ass in tennis. Yes, John, I'm talking to you. And that was very rare because I normally, and that's one of the few, we had about 3 more months of playing until it was just so embarrassing every time I'd go out. But I was hypomanic, just sort of like I am now in this tone. And I went out there and I finished that task and I found the I-quad path and I put the exclamation point, which is, by the way, an I turned upside down. I put the exclamation point on, yes, I think in weird ways. I put the exclamation point on my structure and voila, here we are. At the end of a nice little ride.
Gregg Henriques is a professor and core faculty member at James Madison University's combined integral clinical and school psychology doctoral program. He earned his PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Vermont. The unified theory of knowledge, also known as UTOK, refers to the interlocking set of ideas developed by him to offer the outline of a consilient theory of knowledge and wisdom for the 21st century. UTOK can also be thought of as the unified metapsychology framework, because it solves the current problem of psychology. Gregg, thanks for coming on.
Hey, man. Great to be here. Thanks so much for having me and the introduction. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd love to start off, before diving into UTOK, which will be the main focus of our discussion, it'd be great for our audience to learn about you and the arc of your career. So, sure. I've read, watched, and listened to a lot of your content, but I don't know much about the young Gregg.
All right.
So if you don't mind, let's go to the beginning. Can
Sure.
you tell us about perhaps your earliest memory of an interest in psychology?
Yeah, well, we should start off with a sort of a dork, Let's go there. No, I was raised in Northern Virginia. My dad's a history professor. My mom's a kindergarten teacher who gets her expertise and becomes a professor of early childhood development and an excellent teacher. I get born in Springfield, Virginia, moved to Fairfax. So if you know the Northern Virginia area, my dad's a professor at George Mason University in history. So I have 2 older brothers and 1 younger brother. So 4 boys. So, apologies to my mom in relationship to dealing with that reality. But yeah, I mean, I have I would say a fairly secure, pretty standard childhood, upper middle class white family doing its thing. I'm not super strong in school. My oldest brother is a valedictorian of 800. Then my older brother sort of rebelled, and I'm just kind of coming along the middle, of that. And then my younger brother is 6 years younger than I. And so, I don't do super well in school early on. I got a little bit of a learning disability. I can't read super well. And then I kind of find high school, it's like, what the hell are we learning and why? So I'm kind of a jokester. I'm skipping school. I'm smoking pot. I'm hanging out, doing fine, but not really into it. Sure. I take a class in psychology in my senior year of high school. and find a pull towards that very quickly, and like, oh, yeah, maybe that's what I'll do. So I have a sense going in to my undergraduate career, which I took at James Madison, where I'm currently a professor. So I come back to JMU. I entered in 1988. Quickly became a psychology major, minored or almost minored. I technically didn't minor, but I almost minored in sociology. Fell in love with sociology and psychology. And so the whole social psychology, my first intellectual awakening, I like to say, is feminism. That happens in I also am interested in how the government justified making weed illegal. So I become interested in beliefs about that. I'm one of the early legalize it, because I'm 19 and when I was 16, I remember, or 15, I think I was at a Pizza Hut with my dad, and I bought Nancy Reagan's Just Say No. And I was like, oh God, drugs are so horrible, and I would never do this. And then, a year and a half later, I'm getting stoned. My friends going, what's wrong with this? This is all right. This works. So then I was like, why does I always have sort of an anti-authoritarian streak in me? I hate controlling people, and I hate being controlled. And I always looked at authority and was like, are you guys bullshitting me? At least, and that really was like, oh my God, the government's completely full of shit on this thing. And that was a real wake up call. And ever since then, I've sort of been like, okay, what do I believe? When I was an undergrad, I believed then in science. Okay, so science was my authority, and I thought that the ways in which the world, scientifically justified its knowledge was valid, and I saw myself as being a science, and we really wanted to organize psychology scientifically. That's what was my framework, and I was appreciative of the psychological and social sciences as an undergraduate. And so I majored in psychology, took a lot of sociology classes, was interested in the behavioral and social sciences. I wasn't sure what I was going to do. My girlfriend, in the time would become my wife, she then gonna get her advanced degree in education. I took a year off, bartended, worked at Jiffy Lube, did that for a while, and then applied. Ultimately end up getting into the master's program at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, in clinical and community psychology. And I think there is when a lot of the seeds were planted. I was at that time developmentally, I started to realize I had a knack for understanding shit in general and psychology in particular. I could read abstracts and frames very quickly and essentially kind of deduce what people were saying in a way that I think other people are like, hey, how did you kind of do that? I was like, it just seemed obvious.
Wow.
So I had an emergent talent in relationship to that. I think actually, to the extent that I have an intellectual superpower, I can relate and empathize to people very, very quickly. So once I got over my learning disability and had some background, I could just enter into the mind of the author and say, oh, this is what they're justifying. And of course, justifying is going to become a really key concept for me. And for some reason, I just had a network where I could just place one justification inside the network of justification and see where they're coming from in relation. And that was helpful to be able to get through graduate school. I had great training at the University of North Carolina in Charlotte, and really excellent mentors. The people that founded the thing called post-traumatic growth were there. You've probably heard of PTSD. But it's a lot of people have growth after trauma, and these were pioneers in that, and they were wonderful scientific humanistic professors. I was there for 3 years, very fortunate to get the training there. Went to the University of Vermont. They took some credit for my master's degree, and this is 1996, and that is actually when I transform. In my master's degree, I start doing psychotherapy. I come at it initially with the scientific model. CBT, cognitive behavior therapy, is the most empirically supported therapy. It's pragmatic. We should work to solve people's problems. It shows that it had. And then you get actually into the therapy room. You learn what the real backstory is, and you realize the world's a lot more complicated in terms of that. It doesn't reduce to that claim. And I discovered, really, although I didn't name it exactly at the time, in retrospect, I discovered the problem of psychotherapy, which is how do you be a psychological doctor, grounded in science, that's helping a subject in front of you dealing with all their mental psychological problems. And I thought that would be a coherent way to be in the world, that you get trained as a human psychological scientist that would then become a healing professional, and then you would have a coherent model for being in the world for how you would actually help people with mental problems.
Yeah.
I thought that would actually make sense.
But
I was
sounds
naive.
like there's a but coming.
I was naive as hell. It turns out that doesn't make sense at all.
You were young. You were figuring
Well, the
stuff
interesting
out.
thing is that everybody in the world, at least from my vantage point, should know that a coherent capacity to be a psychological doctor and do therapy, and I can tell you what I mean by the coherent capacity, it doesn't exist. Basically what you have is you have a chaotic, fragmented, pluralistic landscape of knowledge. Okay, meaning that you have all these different insights that are clearly partial. Okay, they're clearly partial, especially when you put them into other justification systems that have interesting insights that are clearly valid within their context. But to use, if anybody's familiar with Ken Wilber's frame, there's no way to include and transcend and conclude all of these to achieve a higher integral state where you're cohering across the various lines and seeing them in proper relation. That doesn't exist in psychotherapy. And I was like, and then my thing, and nobody else has done this, I did this really weird thing, and I already alluded to it. I was like, well, why? If we look at medicine, okay, medicine is relatively coherent. Now, our health field may just be maybe chaotic at the institutional level, but if you just look at medicine, you say, okay, you have a generalist physician, he's trying to help heal injuries and diseases, and then you have specialists that organize around both the disease type and the systems of the human organism, and we have a pretty clear theory of human biology, physiology, and anatomy, okay? And we have a hierarchical arrangement, and you don't get physicians saying, hey, the only key is your gut, and the other people saying, hey, it's your circulatory system.
Right.
It's like, no, your gut and your circulatory system are different biological, physiological systems. And it's all organized by the science of human biology. So why wouldn't psychological therapies and psychological doctors be grounded in and organized in the science of human psychology? Okay. In fact, I was taught mostly that was the way it should be. In fact, there's a whole clinical science move in my field that says, oh, yes, but what they mean is not grounded in scientific knowledge per se. What they mean is grounded in empirical findings. I'll say that differently. There's empirical findings versus scientific knowledge. Okay? Now we can get into what the relationship and difference is. But in my field, all that you turned out that you have, essentially, are empirical findings rather than knowledge.
Right. Okay. Gotcha. You have pieces of the puzzle, but it hasn't cohered.
There's no coherence.
You haven't, integrated it. Sure.
And you ask, well, what the hell do you mean by that? Come on, we know a lot of, there's the stuff we know about psychology. And you're like, well, let's go to the biology example. What is biology? Ask any biologists, there's science of life, right? Okay. And you ask, you know what life is, right? Now we can decide, Schrodinger wrote a thing in 1944. What is life? It's a good question technically. But you go out and you know that a bacteria alive, a tree alive, mushrooms alive. No one debates whether or not there's a thing called life. And no one debates whether biology is that science. Okay. You go to psychology and there's no agreement about what the hell psychology is a science of. Okay. There's no agreement. Okay. Sure. And then you look into it, you're like, well, they say it's the science of behavior and mental process. That's by far the biggest definition, although not everybody agrees with that. Behavior and mental process. If you take a Psych 101 class, that's what they'll tell you. That's what I learned, and I bought that. I thought that was a thing. Right. But actually, when you peer beneath the layer of that justification, you realize that behavior is defined by the methods of science.
Sure.
Behavior is that which is available to you scientifically, and mental processes are what you infer based on the causal relationships between your independent and dependent variables.
Gotcha. Yeah, okay. I think this is something that's come through quite a bit. And just to confirm, you're not screen sharing yet, right? I just want to make sure. Okay, cool. Yeah. Just making sure because I saw you. But something that's come through quite a bit in listening to you, to your great podcast, is that science is more of a tool or a process than a worldview. Right. And a lot of people treat science it creeps in, this sort of the idolatry of science creeps in as being the worldview, but it can't sustain what's needed for, like, I understand, like, you're trying to congeal all these things into digestible parts, right? And I think you have one of the things on your website, it was like that you broke down, I think, into 3 main parts, psychology, into like the professional domain, the general psych, and then I believe the personal. Is that the right?
Well, there's basic psychology, human psychology, and professional psychology.
Right.
Yeah, let's back up on that science point, because this is a really important one to get. Okay?
Yeah.
So, science. What is science? Well, science, specifically the science I'm referring to, which is important, is the science that comes out of the European Enlightenment period, okay, and can be traced to Galileo, often referred to as the father of modern science by many people, and then, of course, a pretty clear line into Newton, classically, and then there's other people like Hoyle, and most classically Einstein. So this line from, say, Galileo to Newton to Einstein is the line of understanding that I'm talking about. And inside this line of understanding are 2 things that we need to separate, which you started to allude to. One is what emerged as a different kind of epistemology. Okay, epistemology is how you know, and the methods by which knowledge is acquired. And modern empirical, natural science, okay, is a new kind of epistemology, which means it brings different ways of knowing. Okay. Sure. Specifically, it's based on a third-person empirical position, meaning you step outside of any particular unique position and adopt an observer position that gathers data that any trained observer can see. This is what science means by empirical.
Sure.
Okay, which actually is not the original meaning of empirical. A meaning is actually first-person empirical, like you are empirically experiencing me right now.
Yep. Sure.
Right.
Yeah. That difference trips me up all the time, because I'll hear someone using it in one frame and then someone else in another. Okay.
Right. Empirical means observation, but there's 2 fundamentally different kinds of observation. There's first-person, unique, particular observation, like I'm observing you. And then there's the fact that this zoom is taking place, and look, it's being recorded, and anything you could then record with a measurement device, and any objective observers could come and say, look at the zoom that we had. So the zoom is capturing a third-person empirical perspective. But they're only zooms in our head, Gregg's and Carlos's, is available only to Gregg and Carlos, okay? And I can't see yours directly, and you can't see mine directly, okay? So what they did was they created a third-person empirical epistemology, okay? And then they tried to tie that to experimentation, mathematics, deduction, all right? These are the methods of science. And then what they did is they utilized that to build certain ontologies. What do I mean by certain? Meaning they mapped the world and then built a model of the world based on this method. That's actually what it yields, the reason that it yields. And so what you get is a matter in motion ontology. Okay.
Yep.
So we got a matter in motion ontology. That's why it's so powerful, and the knowledge that we get when we build technologies and they feed back on science, it does shit in the world.
Yeah, it's very useful. Yeah.
Very useful, and that's because the methods build at least pockets of ontological knowledge. Ontology means knowledge about the world. Okay. So if you look up and say, "Hey, I'm a chemist," all right, very often they'll say, instead of behind that weird garden, they'll have a periodic table of the elements behind them. What is that? That's an ontology. That's like, oh, that is a map, okay, of the things in the world we call atoms. And the atoms are real things in the world. And we have knowledge, the atomic theory of matter. We chemists and physics have knowledge of the way atoms behave. And we can tell you about them. In fact, the value of physics and chemistry outside of physics and chemistry is the knowledge they give us. Sure. Okay. And they do the experiments, and there's a debate about whether there's a scientific method and exactly what it is. There is a scientific epistemology for sure. Okay. And that is, it's a third-person empirical, observationally grounded by experts on an analytically, deductively, inductively, abductively, in other words, reasoned structure to legitimize publicly defendable claims about the world. That is what science fundamentally is about. Okay. So anyway, it's really key because this turns out to be crucial for what happens to psychology and my critique of psychology, okay, in relation. And that is that this failure to distinguish between ontology and epistemology in science allows psychology to just claim the epistemology of science, punt on its ontology, and say that the methods itself will grant us knowledge. And there's partial truth to that, but it's limited truth, at least as far as I'm concerned. It's particularly limited truth when you go back to my original issue of, okay, I want to be a psychological doctor. Okay? Psychological doctor means I'm going to drop into unique, real, particular situations. Okay? And I'm going to have to use my knowledge of psychological science to apply it to the unique, real, particular situation that I'm in. Okay? What that means is I have to take all the research knowledge, collapse them into the generalizable knowledge frames so that I can apply them to the current situation that I'm in. If you can't do that, you can't generalize from the findings to the general to then back to the specific.
Right. Okay.
Does that make sense?
Sure, it does.
Okay. Well, if there's no general,
yeah, what do? You have to
now
put your
you're
own map.
stuck. And then what psychologists do is the practitioners, they go with personal experience, they go with schools of thought, and they go with particular research findings.
Sure.
Okay. I'm saying, well, what about general knowledge? And the answer is, well, you'll never find that. There is no such thing. We can't get that. We'll never get general knowledge. An impossible. Stop asking that question. My field decided you'll never get general knowledge, and you can't. So
why do you think that? Why was that the response? Why did people say that?
Well, because it's good to know your history to know that answer. Okay. So it turns out in the 1850s, okay, so science is getting started in 16th, 17th century. By the 19th century, 1800s, 19th century, the science is really yielding serious advances.
Sure.
Okay. And of course we get Darwin coming along, and it's getting you into the biological sciences, and you got cell stuff going on and other things happening. And people are like, hey, let's apply this to mind. Now you can, the mind, consciousness, human consciousness. Let's apply this method to this thing we call mental. Okay? That happens in the 1850s. The first thing that they do, and it's a brilliant early polymath by the name Helmholtz. And Helmholtz starts doing stuff in relationship to what's called psychophysics. He starts measuring stuff, and other people do this as well. But there's early successes on what are called psychophysics. Psychophysics is relating changes in the exterior stimulus like weight and pressure, okay, and brightness to detectable changes in sensation. Okay, so like, can you feel this? What's the just noticeable difference? All right. And then this becomes obvious to you, but there are these laws. So if I give you 1 pound and you're holding it, and then I add a pound and ask you, can you tell the difference? Okay.
Sure.
Like,
yes.
Sure.
Hopefully.
Okay? Hopefully. Yeah. Now, if you lift weights, okay, and let's say you're deadlifting 100 pounds, all right, which isn't that much for a deadlift. My brother's a professional deadlifter. He got the state record in Virginia for 705 pounds. Okay,
oh my goodness. Yeah. Jesus.
Yeah.
What thighs.
Exactly. That guy's got some serious thighs on him. Woo. But anyway, he would not be able, right when you get to the edge, you're right at the edge, but you can't tell the difference between 650 and 651 pounds. Okay? Like if you lift it, you don't know what that is. Okay?
Sure.
The reason is because actually the sensation translation is proportionally related, meaning that 1 pound is not equal to 1 pound. 1 pound exists in the context of the sensations that you're experiencing, and there's a relative relation. So they started to delineate some of the relative laws of psyche experiences to physical changes. And that's called psychophysics. Super cool stuff. And some of the foundational laws that we have in psychophysics remain to this day. They found them, and that's cumulative knowledge. Okay?
Sure. Cool.
So this 1850s, and then what happens is, we're not really terribly interested in that just sensation. we're actually interested in this whole inner experience that we have, this first-person subjective experience of being in the world. Okay. Now, this first-person experience of being in the world. Now, remember what I said, what science was. Science fundamentally is an epistemology that requires multiple observers seeing the data.
I see the problem.
So now we're going to start up a problem where it's like, wait a minute, I want to see what's in your head, but exactly what I'm interested in is outside my lens of availability. Okay? So I was like, so the founder of psychology, Wilhelm Wundt, argues that what we need to do is we need to train people to become introspectionists. So they're professional introspectionists. And these become then the professional observers in the world. Okay, so I'm going to train you, I'm going to train the guy next to you, and train a guy next to you, and you'll be professional introspectionists. And these will be like the meter readers in physics, where you have to learn how to read the meter. Okay.
How do you train someone? What does that entail, becoming an introspectionist?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this... You'd really want to go ask a Wundtist, like a guy, like this is 1879, and this dies at least, or certainly, and it loses some of its. But there are particular ways in which you would then learn how to describe your experience. For example, okay, so you would just say, okay, I open my eyes. What do you see? Oh, I see a computer. It's like, no, you don't see a computer. You see. And then this would evolve into what's called structuralism. You see all of these different parts is what you actually see. You see the redness or purpleness of my shirt, and then you see the blue of your screen, and you see this, and you see this, and then all of that then is the parts of what you see. That's what you see, okay? Or is it? The Gestaltist, a whole nother people will come along and say, actually, that's the right answer. I see you. I don't see all the parts of you. I see the whole of you. So there's one of the things that happens early on is, well, is the subjective experience of being these holistic forms at a Gestalt level, or are they actually made up of parts? The guy that came off of Wundt, Edward Titchener, developed what are called structuralism, and he identified at one point 44,000 sensory parts that somehow are like Lego blocks that are stuck together that somehow make up experience. So imagine you have Lego blocks. These are all the structures, and somehow what's actually happening is these Lego block systems are getting stuck together, and he's trying to diagnose the fundamental periodic table of psyche elements, okay, 44,000. Well, Titchener's system dies. He brings it over to the United States. It lives for a while, and it dies. That's called structuralism.
Okay. Structuralism.
Structuralism. So the idea, here psychology is, what do you mean by the mental? I mean human conscious experience of being behind your eyes that we develop particular techniques to gain access to.
Got it.
Okay. So that's, other people say that's not what we're interested in. That's not the mental. Okay.
Okay.
That's not what we're interested in. What we're interested in, say the functionalists, is not just what is the parts of conscious experience. What does it do? Okay. What does cognition, consciousness, mental life do? Sure. And then in that question is like, how do people, and then now, by the way, animals, how do they adapt to the world? That's functionalism.
Got it. Mm-hmm.
So for the functionalist, psychology is the science of mental life, where that translates into the ways in which people, and then clearly at least some animals, adapt to the world.
Sure.
All right? So functionalism and structuralism are two different pieces, and they compete. I'll throw two more onto the fire, and then I'll stop. I could go on, but we don't want to spend the whole day on a history class. But basically,
I'm enjoying it.
Right. So then what happens is that it's very hard, okay, to argue about what's going on inside if you take this strong exterior view, okay? And you get John B. Watson in the classic behaviorist tradition that says, screw all that. What's going on, especially against the introspective consciousness people, although he didn't like the functionalists either, what we need to do, what science fundamentally is about, there's stuff that happens in the world, and there are responses that happen. And it is the relationship between action and reaction. Just look at Newton's laws, okay? And what we need to do is we need to pair stimulus with responses and presume there's a physical chain of neural reflex, if we're talking about mental, that links these two. And the psychologist's job is to see how certain stimulus give rise to certain responses. And you get what are called SR, behavioral psychology, stimulus response. Here, Watson has timed the epistemology of science, like how we know, so we're going to now experimentally pair, actually with a physicalist ontology, meaning the only real thing that causes stuff is physical, like stuff, okay? Sure. So he then basically creates a behaviorist school that reduces observable behavior, presumes an underlying physical mechanism, and then is going to tie neural reflexes together. And he finds in this model, he finds work by Ivan Pavlov on what becomes classical conditioning as the perfect model for how neural reflexes emerge and tie together and can give rise to complicated behavior. So he becomes a behaviorist, and it's experimental analysis of stimuluses and responses, what he calls behavior. Okay, so you get that, and the final guy that most everyone will know comes along and says, no, it's not that at all that we're really interested in. People are rationalizing their stuff up here based on what they tell them, and to defend against the underlying animal urges towards sex and aggression that they have. And it is this unconscious relationship between the conscious rationalizer and this core animal piece and the society that they're in that really is what we're interested in. We're interested in the unconscious mind. Okay? And of course, this is Freud. All right? And we're also interested really in how to both understand the human unconscious mind and then how to help it ultimately, although Freud's less really concerned with that. But later on, people are like, hey, we can use psychoanalysis. And he tries to certainly sell psychoanalysis something to use. So let's just really quickly, what do you got? You got the structure of conscious experience. You got the functional adaptations of animals and humans. You have animal into human stimulus response, okay? And then you have an unconscious underneath a conscious rationalizing relation. And these are all different aspects then of the mental, and they all have different vocabularies, and they compete viciously with each other. Okay, at this time, they're literally like religious wars. They're like, wow. If you're a behaviorist, you can't be a psychoanalyst. If you're a psychoanalyst, you're not a Jamesian functionalism. Although some of those, James and Freud did okay together. But many of them were not, were deeply competitive with each other. Okay, and they wanted dominance, and no one won. And it's called the crisis in psychology. Okay, which is like, these are all different things in the world, and there's no way to put them together. And that's the crisis. And for decades, people were concerned with the crisis. And then people decided, getting back to answering your question, you'll never solve this question. The human mind's the most complicated thing in the world. No one's ever going to be able to decide what it is. Ergo, the best we can do is apply scientific methods of interest based on the methods of science. Don't ever ask for an ontology for psychology. That's immature. It's your longing to kill your father and be more superior. And fundamentally, it's your desire to make sense out of the world, which is naive. The best we can do is break the world up into little parts and develop research programs and show empirically derived relationships with the world. So psychology decides it will never have to, it shouldn't commit to ontology. And by the way, there are a lot of things in the world that may not. It's not like everything in the world should commit to ontology. So that's the question, is should it be a methods-based, and is there ontology in the world that actually is up to the task of corresponding the things in the world to our methods and all of these different theories and all the findings of the research programs in a way that turns all this noise into music?
Oh, I love that. I love that bow you put on it. Turn it into music. Wow. Thank you. That was amazing. I appreciate the free lesson on the history and the breakdown. That was amazing. Thank you so much, Gregg. So that gives me a good sense of, so then it's 1996 still, and was this when you had started your psychotherapy practice?
Right. I'd done the psychotherapy, and then I'm actually, at this time, I'm like, God, this is a real problem. There's a lot of noise. I fall into what's called evolutionary psychology, which is an up-and-coming field.
Love evolutionary psych. Yeah.
Oh, good. Well, all right. Well, so evolutionary psych, like when I was initially getting trained in feminism, I thought, any biological explanation for gender and human behavior is this fascist idea. I was like, everything's social. We're, more or less learned blank slate and everything's socially constructed. I sort of bought that language. And then I realized I didn't know anything about a biological theory, anything about evolutionary theory. And then as soon as I realized it, I was like, oh my God, that's absurd.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I saw the pioneering work. It really starts by the guy by the name of Edward Wilson in sociobiology, but ultimately then picked up, and we have Steve Pinker today. And at this time, Leda Cosmides, John Tooby are some of the founders of this thing. Jerome Barkow. 1992, The Adapted Mind is the Bible of evolutionary psych, a great book, deep academic book. I stumbled across that actually through Robert Wright's The Moral Animal.
Oh, I love Robert Wright. Yeah, he's great.
Okay,
too.
well, so that was in 1994. So I'm looking around, and then I find evolutionary psychology, and then from 1994 to 1996, I'm like, evolutionary psychology is going to be, and some of the people in evolutionary psych think that it can, by itself, be the thing that organizes all of psychology and grounds it in a theory. Okay, so that was super exciting. So I was falling into that, and for a while, like for 2 years, I was a full core evolutionary psych guy. I was going to the conferences. I was really loving this stuff. I digested their stuff. I was an evolutionary psych geek. And then that set me up in 1996 to have my first genuine novel insight. Okay, like productive creative novel insight. The productive creative novel insight that I had was I'm learning evolutionary psych. I'm getting trained in psychodynamic psychotherapy. And I'm doing my dissertation on Beckian theory and what are called cognitive psychotherapy and what are called cognitive errors, which are the way in which basically people justify what happens to them and whether or not they're having good or bad consequences and how they explain it about themselves. Okay, that's my dissertation. My dissertation was going to be on that.
Cool.
So I'm learning Beck, and I know cognitive therapy. I know the whole social cognitive world of psychology, like Bandura, Albert Bandura, and anybody knows he's a huge figure. And so I'm in this world, and then I'm learning psychodynamic stuff, which I thought initially was kind of BS, and then I really learned it. I was like, an updated psychodynamic model is totally reasonable. And then I'm learning evolutionary stuff. I have a feminist and sociological background, and all of this background knowledge ultimately congealed into a core insight that I had in late 1996. And the core insight that I had in late 1996 was that so if we were to ask the question, all right, what is it that makes humans different? Okay, we clearly at some levels are different. We're clearly animals, unless you take a really strong religious weird view, at least from a scientific view. We're primates, okay? But something happened to us and we behave super differently than all the other animals, okay? And then if you ask people, you say, well, what is it? And generally you survey, it's like, hey, we're like self-conscious reasoners, okay? That's one, this is a Rene Descartes kind of view. It's like, I think, therefore I am, and then I can wonder about that, and then I can build reasoning from a self-conscious, self-reflective stance, okay? That's one answer. A second answer is kind of even more basic. It seems we talk in a way that's different that other animals sure as hell communicate, but we talk, okay? And that seems different. Other people say, hey, we have this thing called culture, and although other animals sort of have culture, and we can talk about the ways in which they do and they don't really have cumulative culture in the way that we have cumulative culture, okay? So you get self-conscious reasoning, language, cumulative culture. And then the last thing that's super obvious is look around us. We build shit. We used to call us the tool maker or ape or whatever. And then they realized other animals do make tools. But in terms of complicated evolving tools, all right, they don't do that. Okay. So these four things, self-conscious reasoning, language, cumulative culture, and technology are really good. I had an insight that tied the first three together very directly in 1996. Okay. And the short of it is, and we can go into it if you want, but the short of it is this, is that there's a tipping point if you follow the inevitable evolution of language, okay, from shared intention and attention, and we can talk about our primate capacity to sync up our attention and intention, which means I have a sense about what you're doing, and you have a sense about what I'm doing. If I point, okay, at the age of 2-year-old kids are like, get the sense that I'm looking in the look, okay? Other apes don't do that hardly at all. All right, they're they don't understand that there's gestures and that you have a mindset and that your mindset has an intention and that you can share this intention and we can do stuff together.
Oh, surprising. Okay.
Interesting. So other apes' ability to coordinate like hunting, they do it some, but man, by the time 500,000 years ago, we're coordinating our hunting efforts. We're building better tools, although for a long time our hand axes, and then we get fire. But we're not super creative in the tool for a long time. But anyway, we're creative in relationship to our social organization, and then we become cooperative hunters in a way that's fundamentally more complicated than any of the other apes. And there's also lots of reason to believe that we're creating much more complicated, nonverbal, intersubjective relations. Okay, we're probably dancing together. Okay. We're probably engaged in all sorts of kind of rituals together. You see that? We can move that, we can immediately intuit what others are doing, and we can plug into a large scale. If everybody's been at a concert, and just create the rhythm in relationship to that, we're better at that than any other apes. A guy by the name of Michael Tomasello has demonstrated that with repeated and excellent experiments. Okay. So in other words, we can sync up our we space before language better than others. Then we have this symbolic tagging device, our language acquisition device, okay, that basically allows us to then create arbitrary sound relations with certain things that we can share our intention and attention around. All right. Basically, nouns. Oh, here's a coin. Verbs. I'm flipping this coin. Okay. Adjectives. That's a different coin than another coin. Okay. And these are symbolic tags then, nouns, verbs, adjectives, okay, that we can then share. And the argument is that we developed then a symbolic tagging system. Good reason to believe that that was then the next step. All right. And virtually everybody's, I think, it would be consistent with this. There's a lot of debate about how much architecture is embedded in the language acquisition device. People have Chomsky's got a very strong argument. Other people make weaker arguments. This is a pretty weak but emergent argument that says, hey, that clearly was going on. And then what it says is that there was a tipping point when you shift from symbolic tagging to symbolic syntactical propositional speech. Okay, I'll say that again. It's this tipping point when there's a symbolic tag to propositional speech. And the example I always use is, hey, they're antelope, okay, versus there are the antelope. That's the difference. There is a tag indicator, okay, antelope obviously at a noun. You can intuit what I mean, okay, but that's not a proposition. A proposition is a symbolic syntactical structure that makes a positive truth claim on the world. Okay? There's nothing false or true about their antelope unless you then infer and then you say what you really mean is there are the antelope. Now, once you have that, I can now then say, if you make that claim, we can then ask whether that claim is true. Okay? And then whether it's good. And this is the point, is that with propositions, what you get is you get a positive truth claim. And by virtue of pulling our attention to a positive truth claim, that actually creates what I call negative space in the counterfactual. It opens up, by virtue of pulling our truth to this attention, it opens up all the possibilities around it, okay, that can then be wondered as to whether or not that's true or not, or good or not. Okay? All right? And then we can see that what we are designed then to interpret symbolic syntactical structure, but even more so, the next immediate step is then interpret the relationship of those claims to other possible claims. And here's what you get. You get the question.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
What question? What do you mean?
Well,
I'm asking you the question.
Right. Well, notice I made a truth claim, and then you opened up some negative space. Wait, fill this in. I don't get this. Okay. All right. Who, what, when, why, how. Those are all, you could think of those as all little docking stations that open up possible alternative or negative spaces that you can't fill in. They're all the antelope. When did you see them? Okay. Are those antelope? How do you know? All right. So in other words, what you do is you then dock into the propositional claim with a question that then opens up all sorts of potential supporting or competing propositional network claims.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm following. Yeah,
All right.
that's cool.
So what the proposition does is it creates a question-answer dynamic around the proposition and whatever it's networked to.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
This is called the problem of justification.
Okay.
Justification is the problem of how do you legitimize propositions in groups and how do you legitimize the networks of propositions in groups. You've got to solve the problem of legitimizing function. That's what essentially, so if you're going to bring a question, you're going to bring a potential negative space, and now you have a legitimizing function problem. That's what I call the problem of justification.
Okay, cool.
Okay? Mm-hmm. Which in essence is how the hell you know what you're talking about and how the hell is what you're talking about good?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And why the hell should we pay attention to you or should you pay attention to me? Okay? So these are the value-based justifications. What I realized then is the evolution of propositions created the problem of justification. Okay? This problem of justification, at a minimum, brings the accuracy problem, like does it correspond to the truth claims of the world? Mm-hmm. And it brings two forms of value problems at least. Okay? One value problem is this good for me, from my vantage point, if I'm sharing it? And then, is it good for the group? In a dyad, is it good for you? In a community, is it good for us? Mm-hmm. Okay. In other words, should we pay attention to this? So those are antelope over there. There are rabbits over there, and there are berries over there. If I'm good at gathering berries, and I'm not good at snaring rabbits, and I'm good at hunting antelope, X, Y, and Z, then all of a sudden the validity and the utility of those emphases may differ tremendously. So now it's like, well, what are we going to pay? It's much better for me if we go pay attention to berries, and you for rabbits, and Joe for antelope. Okay. Mm-hmm. So what are we paying attention to and how? What's for the individual, what I call the personal problem of justification, the group, the social problem, and then the analytic problem. So you have three fundamental, immediately apparent problems. One fact-based problem. Does it correspond to the state of affairs? Is it analytically defensible? And then the second is two value-based problems, one at the individual and then one at the group level. Okay?
Cool. Yeah, I'm with you. Can I ask you, just going back a couple minutes, the propositional truth claim, and that opens up a negative space counterfactual, mm-hmm. because you have to test the truth, right?
Put it to the extent that it makes a affirmative claim, right. You can now then say, well, there would be other negative claims that would compete with it at some level. Either invalidate it itself at a truth level, or qualify it, or at a value level, replace it as a more valuable way of framing what's going on. When I learned cognitive therapy, the thing you train cognitive therapy, people on is you get a thought in your head. Two fundamental questions you ask. Is it accurate? Mm-hmm. Is it helpful? Okay, so that's a super simple way of just asking the truth, and the reason is the propositions are crucial because they're the things that actually make affirmational truth value claims, and once you make an affirmational, then it pulls space, and you can imagine all the constraints or possibilities around it, and that's what the questions then do. Sure.
So interesting. And do you have any thoughts as to? I mean, this would be tough to find in the records in like the, say, ancient history or even before that. But why do you think this is the kind of thing that bubbles up inevitably, or do you have a theory as to why things check out this way?
Yeah, well, the bottom line is it makes lots of different things now to check out. Okay, so we can first off, it's what's called. I got trained in evolutionary psych. One of the best frames for evolutionary psych is what's called reverse engineering. Okay, a reverse engineering says that if you have an evolutionary idea about what drove the function of it, you can then see what the current design structure is and trace it back and make a very clear, hypothesis but the hypothesis is the function problem that I'm pointing to should show up in the complex adaptive design of today.
Sure.
Okay. So really clear example I use of this is your ear. Okay. You can hypothesize, hey, I think the ear is super crucial for sex. Okay. And then you have to try to justify why, what is the ear designed and why is it super crucial? That's actually hard to do. Yeah. If you were to say, I think the ear is designed to channel sound waves into your inner ear, and it's structured to capture those sound waves, and its folds are actually designed to push the right sound into the inner ear to get it on the hammer anvil and create the sound so that it amplifies it. That's a much better hypothesis. So we've now just reverse engineered the structural size, folds, organization of the human ear, outer ear, and had a much better idea. So the argument now, if this is the case, then we should be able to look at human mentation, broadly defined, and we should be able to see that there's now an add-on functional structural system that serves as an interpreter, propositional interpreter network on top of a subjective experience of being that navigates the problem of justification around it, both inside of itself, especially at what's going to be defining the personal problem, relative to its place then on the social field, and then collectively groups are going to have to get together and solve the collective problem of justification. That's what it says. Okay. And then I just ask your audience, hey, have you ever had to justify yourself? you ever wondered that, you ever have to kind of sit and you feel yourself, and then you have to think about, why am I doing what am I doing? Mm-hmm. Have you ever had the circumstance where you tell some people some things about why you do what you do, and then you shift some of that explanation, whether either you're alone or with somebody else? Have you ever had that issue happen?
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely.
In fact, that's so much the process of living that when you open your eyes and you see this, and this is what happened to me, I'm a justifying ape. That's not like, do I do this? I am this.
This is like an epiphany for you. Do you remember the moment this snapped together, or was it gradual? Was it all at once?
There was in the next insight that I have, there's an absolute all at once moment. Sure. In this, there was a collection of insights, but there's a particular moment. I really would love to go back and see. There was within a couple of days it happened, if not in one day. Okay, here's the story I tell. Yeah. I confess on this one, it could be a confabulation, but I'm pretty clear. It certainly happened within a cluster of days. But here's the story I tell, okay? And it certainly makes a point. So in those days, you didn't have cell phone, all right? So this is late 1996, December of 1996, okay? I'm up in Vermont. I live with my wife in Winooski, which is right next to Burlington, okay? What has happened to me in this insight, I've had this insight since November-ish to October. I do a evaluation on a woman, okay, a psychiatric evaluation on a woman who comes in and looks completely antithetical to some of the immediate predictions that this theory makes. What this theory makes is it says that on average, people will try to justify and explain themselves in a way that affords them social influence. That's one of the basic, okay? So why does everybody think that they're above average? Why does everybody tend to, hey, if you get an A, it's because you're cool. If you get an F, it's because the teacher sucks. Okay. We know that in general, people have very strong biases to explain bad events exteriorly and interior events take credit for. There's a strong bias there. There's all sorts of attributional biases, my side bias. Hey, if my group did it, that's understandable. If their group did it because they're assholes, that's a core justificatory system inside of us, okay? And you can show this as cross-cultural.
Sure, everyone does.
I'm meeting with a woman who has essentially the reverse. I am a horrible piece of crap, okay? That's what her whole, more so. So she looks pretty attractive. She thinks she's ugly. We take a test. She's got an IQ of above average. She thinks she's totally stupid, okay? Anybody that's worked clinically knows that with certain personality structures called avoidant personality, and certain other kinds of psychopathology like major depressive disorder, you can get total shifts where the system is essentially critiquing itself far harsher than anybody else. Okay? It's turned against itself. All right. Well, why on earth, if the system ego is designed to justify its actions, why the hell would, okay, so that seems, that's it. So I'm listening to this, I'm seeing this, and now I ask this woman the story. So here, so this woman who I did a psychiatric evaluation on had made a suicide attempt. Her father 6 months ago had died, and I'm getting this history. She grew up in rural Vermont. Her father's a raging alcoholic. Her mother's timid, okay, and abused and cowed. She has an older brother, okay, who when he starts 10, 11, 12, he's like 4 years older than she, 3, well, it doesn't matter. He starts getting rebellious, okay? And he and dad have a number of physical alterations where he would be physically dominated by dad and beaten. Several that she distinctly remembers is, why can't you be more obedient like your sister? So she, as an 8-year-old, is watching her 12-year-old older brother get the shit kicked out of her, okay? Like him. And she hears, why can't you be more obedient? By the way, her father never beats her. Okay, goes the whole life. But Saul beat mom, beat the other, but never beat her for something. Okay. Now, let's think about, this woman then develops an unbelievably turned against inward justification system. You are a piece of shit. You are no good. You'll never be able to do anything. Okay? Let's put it in this context. Would that serve anybody anything to believe that you are powerless, ineffective, don't deserve anything? Let me ask you, you're in a situation where your father's completely abusive to the older brother, and now you're coming along, and I were to give you 2 choices. Carlos, tell yourself you're really deserving and that no one should treat you that way, and that you are totally entitled to being treated like a human being, okay? Versus, Carlos, you're a piece of shit. You deserve, you have no capacity to wander around in this world. You better listen to authority. Now ask yourself, which one of those do you think is actually going to get your ass beaten more if you're an 8-year-old with a drunk father? Okay?
Yeah.
So the argument here is that, oh my gosh, there's a turn against the self function, which clearly is maladaptive here. Sure. But in this other sense, where did it come from? It could well have been learned as an adaptive turn against mechanism, as a way of a primate submitting, I'm a piece of shit. You don't need to hit me anymore. Okay? And we know that these submission functions are very powerful. You have to be pretty insane to keep coming after somebody once they throw up their hands and say, you win. Okay? So what we're seeing in this case is, so I then was engaged. I was learning about this. I brought this case to my classmates, and I was dialoguing about them. And I was like, oh my gosh, I've told you about this justification idea. And I would say this woman looks like she's an exception, but it's actually an exception that potentially proves the rule. I can now, because this was sort of a problem to me before, I can now say, when we looked why people turn against themselves, it's because they're anticipating threat, and they're then preemptively critiquing themselves because they imagine they're going to get hammered. And so the turn against the self may be erroneous, sometimes maybe not, but it's the way to protect the self and be submissive before you get punished exteriorly. Sure. Okay? So I'm all excited about this. I'm telling them, blah, blah, blah. Now, the context of this is that a week earlier, I was a half an hour late to my wife, and I tried to be very much on time. And so she was a little annoyed about that, but whatever. We don't have cell phones. I'm in the midst of a conversation right here. I'm supposed to be home at 6, okay? I'm telling all my friends, hey, this is good, blah, blah, blah. I look up at 6:20, all right? It's like, oh, shit, I'm supposed to be home at 6. I got to go, okay?
Yeah.
So I race out to my car, get in the car. I'm on my way. It's from Burlington to Winooski, in the middle of snow, and they do some construction. So I get stuck. It takes me 10 minutes longer to get home, okay? So I get home at 6:35 when I thought I was going to get home at 6:25. I thought it was only 5 minutes away. It turns out I'm 15 minutes away. Needless to say, my wife is sitting there, appropriately annoyed, comes in, what's going on? You were supposed to be home at 6. And I say, the traffic. They're doing construction. The traffic.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Automatically, I didn't. And then this is why I said I'm a justifying 8. Okay. My automatic interpretive public system did not say, well, actually, that I really love my theory ideas, and I think about them more so than I think about you. And it was more important to me to spend these 20 minutes with these individuals than consider your 20 minutes and waste them towards you. I was also 10 minutes late by traffic, but the dominant reason that I'm late is because I care more about these theory ideas than your time. I didn't say that.
Yeah.
Does everybody out there hear that and say, oh my gosh, I normally talk that way? If you do, you probably got problems. You better be reflective about talking that way. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Later, you can talk that way when you have a safety, but the first thing that you say is traffic. Okay. So that's what I encourage the audience to do. Isn't the first thing you say is traffic in that situation? Yeah. And isn't that natural?
Yeah.
Why? Because you're a justifying ape. And the first thing you track is your social influence, and you find the most believable explanation for your action that protects you from damaging social influence. Okay? That's what your interpretive system will do. In fact, we know that it does this because you can actually isolate your interpretive system. When you cut the corpus callosum, this is called split brain patients, you have a talking left hemisphere. That's why I was talking up here. And we can cut it off, meaning cut it off from communication, get you to do stuff, okay? Like we can command you through your other brain to go take a drink and come back and you say, hey, Carlos, why did you get a drink? And you say, oh, I was thirsty. Okay? That's not why you went and got a drink. Yeah. We just commanded you, but your interpretive hemisphere doesn't know it. And so what it automatically do is it searches the possibility space for what's the most reasonable, justifiable idea that narrates what it is that can be given to other social people who have their opinions and do it in a way that legitimizes your, or at least minimizes the threat that you're going to be punished. Okay? So that's what I mean in terms of reverse engineering. It says at an individual level, your egoic consciousness system should be navigating the social contingencies of what's justifiable and trying to download what's legitimate relative to your animalistic impulses. And your felt sense of experience of being in the world should be this conflict between your animalistic impulses and society's standards. Remember I said this guy Freud?
Heard
this
of
is
him.
Freud! Okay,
Yes.
This is what I call Freud's fundamental insight. The justification frame, hypothesis, actually provides the right causal explanatory network to understand why we are verbal primates stuck in this conflict where we have a narrating system that's trying to make sense out of our sex and aggression on a socially acceptable stage. And if you live in Victorian Europe and can't even talk about sex and aggression, you better believe you're going to have serious repression dynamics that are operative. Okay.
Okay, I'm following. I'm liking this. This is great.
So this is 1996, and I'm like, oh my God, this, and by the way, this is when I stopped, ironically, because it's a total evolutionary hypothesis, this is when I stopped becoming an evolutionary psychologist.
Because there's no evolutionary basis for it? I mean, but before us? Is that why?
No, there's a total grounded evolutionary basis. But here's the deal, to get back to the problem of psychology. What this then says is we have to totally differentiate human psychology, and this finds the grounds to differentiate human psychology, okay, from animal psychology.
Sure.
And it points to the core difference of animal psychology and human psychology. Humans build systems of justification that are fundamentally legitimizing structures. They build a co-created construction of reality, which, by the way, brings you over to what's called social constructionism, okay, which is a more postmodern epistemology. And evolutionary psych is battling postmodernism, okay? And it's also battling, by the way, behaviorism. I'm going to come back and pull behaviorism into this equation. So evolutionary psych is trying to etch out its particular structure, and it's defining itself as a cognitive evolutionary model. It's defining itself against social constructionism and against behaviorism. And it turns out the way it defines itself against both of those narrow its field, okay, and force it into particular kinds of framings that prevent it from being what it says it is, which is actual general theory, okay, interestingly. And then when I brought us to the leaders, like Lita Cosmede and John Tobey, I was like, it's Lita, especially I didn't talk to John. I was like, hey, all the shit you did with the reasoning task, okay, I can now download with justification all of your human reasoning tasks, cheater detection modules, and virtually all other reasoning biases, and place a generalized but evolved justification device on top of our primate system. And then that's going to account then what happened isn't a million different little Swiss Army knives that gives us all these different instincts. That's the domain module. What happened was a generalized justifying system that got stuck on top of a primate system. That's actually what happened. Okay. So that's a much more domain general, and it's much more open to some of the other big picture frameworks in the world, like a postmodern social constructionism. In fact, postmodern social constructionism says, hey, we're listening to a socially constructed justification system, and these evolutionary psychologists think that they have truth, but they're actually living in a socially constructed justificatory narrative, which we all are, which we'll never get out of. That's a whole nother issue about epistemology. Just comes along and says, hey, I got a totally new angle on all of this.
Okay.
And so it was sort of, I tried to meld with them, but it was hard. And then what I discovered when I was stoned in 1997, and then I had the popping insight called the tree of knowledge. And when I had the popping insight of the tree of knowledge in 1997, 8 months after all of this, that was a fucking game changer. That was then everything, then the entire picture, essentially the entire picture of knowledge, at least scientific knowledge and psychological scientific knowledge changed. And then that becomes a different paradigm, a real unified paradigm, because what it does is it actually tells you what psychology is inside of it. And evolutionary psychology doesn't. Like, is evolutionary psychology about animals or about people? Evolutionary psychologists don't agree on that answer. Some of them say it's really basically just about people, even though all the arguments are essentially pertain to animals. Okay, and that is because they don't know what they refer to in the concept of psychology. They're stuck in the. This is where I learned the problem of psychology, was when I tried to see what's wrong with evolutionary psychology. It doesn't know what it's referring to. In its frame. It's referring to this big general mental process, mostly humans, but some animals, but doesn't really know the frame, and it doesn't have an ontology, really. It has a weak ontology. Okay.
Oh, okay. Got it.
And that's becomes super crucial later down the road.
Cool.
So that's you're justifying ape. Woohoo!
Justifying ape. I got it. And I mean, sorry. I mean,
but you're not just that. So we can
get
on.
You're more of the things, but the justification is really interesting. Quick tangent. I had my bike stolen a few months ago in New York City, which was a huge bummer. But It's funny but this is reminding me how quickly, because, I was actually on the phone with my mom when I realized my bike was stolen. And I was like, oh no. I was like, dang. I told her, she's like, oh no, that's terrible. And she was like, well, at least you're safe. At least someone didn't rob you at gunpoint.
Right.
It could have been worse. And we do this all the time. It could have been, well, look at it this way. Look at it,
Totally.
Yeah, so.
Yes, it's called, there's a whole field called cognitive dissonance, okay? And that's basically trying to maintain a particular it's your motivationally propositional anchored world view that's trying to maintain a justified state of being. That's essentially what it's trying to do. And it will do,
Sure, got it. Cool. So Tree of Knowledge, 1997.
1997,
yeah. Cool. So what would be the most fruitful path forward? Do you want to keep going on the sort of the arc of your career, your life, or do you want to jump into UTOK? I mean, I want to be cognizant of, your time and what we want to
Sure. No, I've got at least 11, if not more, another 45 minutes or so. Well, I mean, I can certainly, it probably makes sense to go into the Tree of Knowledge a bit. And I could certainly share a screen if we wanted to do that.
Let's do it. Let's jump into it because, for the audience, as you're bringing that up, for people that don't know, you have a lot of visuals that you use. Did you call it, what is it, sincere irony? I forget the term you use for, what is it? Is it earnest?
Yeah, well, so there's a thing called metamodernism, okay. Which is, that's a way of thinking about the world that is characterized by sincere irony. Okay, so that's metamodern is characterized by sincere irony. That actually relates to the whole conversation we were having in the sense that modernism is the idea that science gives us truth claims. We'll just put it's a lot of things, but one of the things that is modern that are independent of subject and social context. So science gives us the hydrogen atom, and it doesn't matter whether you're from Africa or whether you believe it or not. It's just true. Okay, all right. Postmodernism comes along and says the world's in the more sophisticated versions, the world's a lot more complicated than that. Okay, in their radical versions, all knowledge is just immanently constructed and only contingent in the context, and there's no generalized truth claims. Okay, but at the very sophisticated versions, okay, there's some truth, but really all the relevant human truths and everything that you say this means is all embedded in a power-based system of justification. They don't use that term, but that's essentially what they point to. In fact, my first insight was feminism, and the whole feminist insight, this is before my whole theory, was I thought things were fair. But hey, I'm a white guy. It was fair, you know? I'm a privileged white guy. Who would have thunk it? And then I got educated that, you know, this whole Western Enlightenment thing wasn't just necessarily about scientific truths. It was about domination. It was about alienation. It was about marginalization. Let's look at women. How have they been since we went from hunter-gatherers, when they're pretty equal, into traditional societies where men then dominate the crap out of them for 5,000 years? Is that cool? No. And then I go back to my 4 sons and my dad, and then look at my mom and like, geez, you know, it's like, I thought this was fair and maybe not. So what does that mean? It's like the systems of collective justification are shaped by people in power, biased toward the in-group. It's a miracle, okay? But postmodernism essentially affords us that insight in many ways, and then all of its ramification. Metamodern, so then you have the thesis that we can use science. And then you have the postmodern thesis, which is an antithesis. It just critiques it. No, you can't gain outside of cultural context. There's no grand position from nowhere. There's no grand meta-narrative. Metamodern says, actually, both of those things are synthetically true in relation, or you can build a frame that are synthetically true in relation, okay? And it's a sincere modernist, in the sense that I'm really telling you. Ironic, hey, it isn't a position that we're all bullshitters, I'll tell you that. So I'm a justifying ape that actually tells you I have keys to the universe. Hey, huh? Starting with the fact that I'm a justifying ape. Right. And indeed, that feeds back on postmodern. It's like, well, you are making the claim that we're justifiers. That's actually an ontological claim. I'm now at a place that I can place that ontology inside of the natural universe. That's the tree of knowledge, and that's the insight that I'll share right here.
Cool.
Okay. So if I share my screen here, folks can see it. Good. Yep. All right. So what you guys, what we're looking at here, there's a map of the justification. Here's the tree of knowledge insight. This is the actual drawing. I am stoned in my kitchen, okay, in 1997. I have this whole idea at the time called justification idea, justification theory, which you can see is this is what these little words mean.
Yep.
Justification theory. And the justification theory is the thing that differentiates us from the primate world. We split off from the primate world. Sure. Okay. Well, so I'm focused on this area, and I'm pulling out, which can be, if you think like a behavioral scientist, I'm pulling out the analysis of variance around the frequency of human persons relative to the rest of the animal world. Okay. In particular, I'm pulling out this space, and that's where all my focus is, relative to the space beneath it. But in this moment, I'm like, well, hey, actually, I can pull out the animal mind space out of biology. I can pull biology out of chemistry. I can go back to the Big Bang and pull out matter. Everything collapses into energy matter cluster, and the material universe is popping out of this. Okay. And then what you notice, you have the subject up here, but then we get this more objective scientific knowledge construction using statistics and mathematics to map the evolution of complexification. And then this is a point that I'm now looking at back going, oh, here's the map of the universe.
Got it.
Okay. Cool. So that's what that is. And then this becomes a more... I'm going to go to a different slide deck here that I prepared for us. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
This becomes this thing called the tree of knowledge system.
Got it. Yep.
Okay. And, this is actually very similar to the original diagram. The only thing it does is it gives you, it puts it on the time dimension explicitly. Okay. Yep. So what it shows is you got the Big Bang back here. That's when we were just an energy information form. And then out of that becomes this form over, for 10 billion years, the material universe of objects, stars, atoms, it evolves. And then in our history, so that by 4 billion years ago, maybe there was life, maybe not, but as far as our little line goes, about 3.8 billion years ago, this thing jumps so that by 700 million years, you get this evolution of the living world, which is like, bacteria to trees. All right, trees are more recent, but you get the point.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Then about 550 million years ago, you get what's called the Cambrian explosion. That's when all the animals appear, mostly, okay, especially all the complicated animals. Okay, before the Cambrian explosion, you got like jellyfish and sponges and maybe some planaria worms that are right there. And then within a 5 million, maybe, and certainly within a 30 million year period, which in geological time is very short, you get the explosion of all these animal bodies and brains and doing what animals do. Okay. Now, this becomes super important to psychology because what I want to say is what animals do should be called mindedness. Okay, and it's marked by this dimension in red called mind. Okay, so animals exhibit mindedness like bacteria exhibit livingness. Okay, and in this meaning, the term mind then refers to a third dimension of complexification that is observable to you as life is observable to you. Okay,
Sure.
so you go into the forest and you see matter. You see the rocks lying there. You see the trees and the flowers. That's the green. You see the squirrels and the bees. That's mindedness. Okay.
Yep.
From the outside, mindedness refers to the functional awareness and responsivity of animals as they engage in sensory motor looping. Basically, they're taking stuff in, moving around. Okay. Now, notice when we started this conversation, all right, we talked about the problem of psychology, and it turns out this whole idea of how to frame mind, the language of mind, is at the epicenter of this. Okay.
Sure. Right.
Okay. And the idea that you can, how do you frame mind scientifically? And the answer is we never figured that out. Okay.
We still, yeah.
And the reason we never figured it out is because we never figured out how, we never had the right system that got all of the lines correct about where we need to draw our divisions. Okay. And UTOK comes along and says, well, here are all your lines that you need. And when you have all the lines, then you can get a clue about how to take all the noise and start to turn it into music. Okay, because you can see what the instruments are playing, rather than each instrument claiming I'm the entire song. I can now say, oh, you're all the instruments, and the voices and justifications you were giving are actually fit in the proper tone and the proper place. And then with this perspective, I can take the noise and turn it into music. Okay, so if I bring the tree of knowledge back up, okay, I'll show you. Okay, so the first line that is important to realize is when science started, the ontology was matter in motion. Okay, meaning that everyone thought that everything was just a bunch of little billiard balls.
Sure.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. Well, then the 20th century happened later on, and they're actually that's not it at all. However, I interpret this as quantum field theory and Big Bang telling us there's what I call an energy information implicate order underneath the material dimension of complexity. Okay? You can frame this a lot of different ways. I think that's very justified way. What no one can claim is that the universe goes into tiny, tiny material billiard balls. We know that's 100% not true. But that's the ontology of the time. So everything is materialistically based, and we know actually radiation, quantum fields, Big Bang, energy, whatever we want to, it's a tough term to define, but I call it energy information. That resides underneath the standard classical matter in motion world. Okay? That's important because actually, if the world is much more like energy information than it is billiard balls, when we get to mind, energy information is going to be a lot closer to the concept of mind, okay, than billiard balls is. All right. So that's one line, but line under matter is really key.
Sure.
Okay. Then we get the line from matter to life. Okay. And this is really key because it says that life in the tree of knowledge is different than matter.
Sure.
Okay.
Is the line between them, is that an example of hard emergence?
Right. Well, there's terminology issues here that are bound. Sure. They're strong, weak. Okay. But here's what I'll say. Life is a kind of dimensional emergence. What I mean by dimension, well, just the vision logic of this thing. Okay, so this was gray, and now this is green. And there's a vision logic about how it's dimensional, okay? Meaning that, okay, I'll put it this way. Chemistry, going from particles to atoms to molecules, is all within a dimension, Okay, there's emergence among the layers of matter, from particles to atoms to molecules across scale. There's emergence there, but it's within dimension emergence. Okay, life is a between a dimension. All right, and then we try to figure, and people have a long time been confused about why or if life is just complicated chemistry, okay, or if it's something more. The early arguments, okay, was that between a billiard ball reductionism, okay, life is just, versus elan vital, which is the idea that somehow God or some other creature creates a new force, okay, that's made of a new substance.
Right.
Then there were the emergentists that said, oh, well, okay, you get emergence, and emergence are new properties somehow, and in life is one of the emergence. And then the question is, well, is there different kinds of emergence? And that's one of the things the tree of knowledge really solves. Okay. Yeah. And it says that the life is a different kind of emergence than chemistry.
Sure.
Okay. And I can get into that, but the bottom line is that the way in which living systems process information between and communicate with, process information within a cell and communicate between cells, that's different. Okay. And that's a new causal force in the universe. Oh my God, it's a new causal force. It's an epistemic, a knowing force in the universe. Biology gives rise to a new epistemic force, an epistemic knowing force, and there are complicated reasons that I could explain, but the way knowing forces work in the universe are different than the way physics works. And you say, well, how the hell does that work? It's like, well, I can explain that, okay? But you need to understand the matter to life joint point, and then that creates this vision logic then of, well, out of matter comes life, and then out of life comes mind, and then out of mind comes culture. And each one of these things, these big dimensional shifts, is a function of what? Information processing and communication networks.
Sure.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So you get cell on cell, and you get DNA, RNA as informational structures, okay, and cells communicate clearly with each other. And then you get animals with a brain. So the brain is like the DNA, RNA, only at a macro level, pulling cells together. It's an information processing system, and animals are communicate prey, predation, reproduction, all that. They're communicating with each other. So you get, and probably at the Cambrian explosion, what happened is prey predation is probably the big driver. It's like, oh, I can eat things other than plants. I'll eat other animals. And then other people are like, animals are like, no. And so now you got eating as the fundamental driver of complex active bodies with brains and warfare, basically pincers and detectors and all of the stuff that animals do as they jump around. But the information processing, nervous system, communication, animal on animal, sensory motor, dancing. Okay. Sure. And plants communicate. Don't get me wrong. Plants have a lot of intelligence. Don't get me wrong. But they don't have sensory motor looping intelligence, and that's another layer on top of the structure. That's all.
Got it. Got it.
And then talking, justifying, which takes our minds and networks them together in a propositional network. So now we have a whole nother kind of information processing system, a symbolic syntactical open system of information processing called language. Okay. So now each one of these is an information processing epistemic knowing system, biological, animal psychological, human person knowing system, where we can point to the language system, the knowing system, DNA, RNA, nervous system, language. And then UTOK, or the tree of knowledge, says, oh, these are the causal macroscopic relative to information processes. And then boom, you get the tree of knowledge. And so then it says, hey, you got to go from matter to life, and then you got to go from life to minded animals. Those are different. That's the joint point then between life and mind. And then you go from primates to persons. That's the joint point between animal mindedness and culture person. Okay. And ultimately, you then finally, so in terms of solving this problem, you then finally get the last joint point, which is then science as a particular kind of justification system. Okay. And then getting the whole science relative to, finally, then I built this thing called this weird I-quad coin. Okay. Whereas the tree of knowledge tells us how to understand the world scientifically. Remember, based on the epistemology of third person, hey, that's a map of all the behaviors in the world from a very general human perspective. Starts with Big Bang, blah, blah, blah. Okay? The I-quad coin, this refers to your human identity function, and that just means, hey, it's Carlos in the world, and then it's Gregg in the world. And UTOK then comes ultimately with this knowledge system that says, here's your map of your science language, which then tries to usually just factor out or get rid of an individual subjective qualitative, and then says, here's your placeholder for your subjective qualitative. And if you marry your coin to the tree, meaning you'll take, I figure out how to identify my human identity function with the scientific understanding of the world given by the tree of knowledge, I've all of a sudden got a system that's like, oh, I can put my subjective and objective language systems together completely.
Cool.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
All right. So much to cover. I like the iQuad coin also. I mean, of course, I've heard you've written, and there's also the association with Euler's formula.
Yes.
Or identity. You've kind of tied that in. There's also, I'm trying to think, is it also tied to Ken Wilber's integral theory as well? I mean, there's
right. It's a quadratic. Right.
Sure.
So if we can why don't we? Okay. So that's tree of knowledge. All right. So that's 1997.
Sure. Yeah, sir.
And then I'm like, so I'm still a total normal academic at this point, and I'm like, oh, I built this whole theory, and I now figured out what I think is a really important problem. It's like, and I'm going to bring it. I then go work with Aaron Beck. I've got good credentials. I start publishing the shit out of the world. Okay, inside the academy. And I'm trying to teach the academy or make the claim that we can do better, through argument. And I had the naive view that would matter. Okay. And by naive, it's really the case that you can't just do it through argumentation. But I'm a theorist. That's what I wanted to do.
Sure.
But there's no there's no zone of proximal development inside the institution. Okay. The institution's already closed off to this whole idea, and it's already built its legitimizing functions and reward structures on empiricism, okay? And their theories are dime a dozen in the system, although that's valid ones. But then you come in and although everyone that I talk to is like, yeah, no, that makes sense, that makes sense, that makes sense. No, you're right. Okay, at the bar picture, I mean, I talked to a lot of people. Okay,
sure,
and this is the argument. It's pretty straightforward. It's very conservative. It's just this and this and this. I'm not saying any woo. I'm just sort of like, science is this.
It's a framework,
You do this, and it's very experienced near, and it's very scientific. It's very conservative. But the institution doesn't give a shit. Okay, and I don't mean that personally, although I took it personally at times, my ego.
Of course.
But it was like the system doesn't know how to reorganize itself through argumentation. I'd have to get millions upon millions of dollars and start a research program. Okay. Mm-hmm. In fact, this is what I was going to do in 1996 when I discovered justification. All right. Was like, oh my God, I'll start building studies and seeing if this really works. Right.
Sure.
Okay. Well, what do you think might have happened when I started doing that? I started realizing, oh shit, this theory's coming alive right as I do it. Right? I'm building a justification system. And then it shifts from this, you expect it to be this explanatory deep system. And it goes from being this cool explanatory system to actually being even an cooler, and this is inverted, descriptive system. Inverted in the sense, normally you go from description to explanation. This thing goes from description to explanation back into description, so that now I'm like, I'm a justifying ape. I can't falsify that. That's my metaphysics. It's simply the way I now frame myself. So it became, because if I were to then try to justify it scientifically, I'm actually, no matter what the study is, and no matter how I try to frame it, and I saw the way people did research and everything else, you know what researchers do? They justify their findings to get their damn thing through peer review. Okay? And the entire process is already embedded in the argument that it's already been made. So I didn't need to actually do that. I needed to shift the entire structure. Well, this is how deep the argument goes, but the institution, and I don't mean this meanly or personally to anybody, it's just like the institution doesn't know what to do with that.
You put up a mirror to psychology.
Right.
And psychology didn't like what it saw.
Well, it already repressed the idea that you could ever answer this question, and that it answered this question and said your empirical methods, which was going to be your salve here, is this actually a rationalization. And all this time when you're trying to do physics is you're clapping with one fucking hand, and you're generating all this information but not cumulative knowledge, and you know that to be true in your heart. Okay, well, people, that's a little threatening.
No, yeah, people don't want to hear, what is it? I think it's maybe Schopenhauer, I can't remember who it was, but no, Wittgenstein, who said people need to see the truth for themselves, something to that degree.
Sure.
Where like you can't tell people. It's hard. If people are really open and they'll listen to you and they'll open their hearts, but you have to like see the path on your own.
Totally.
You know,
the primate system needs to be in line.
there.
To do it through the justification system alone is actually very weak. Okay, we need to be embedded in it, and then with the justification system is a rider on a horse. Freud knew that. Okay, the horse is running, and then you're justifying after that almost always to tell the person, hey, you're running in the wrong direction. Maybe, but I got to keep going.
Sure.
You got to get that horse turned around. So anyway, so my point is in relationship to this, I tried to stay inside the academy. I shifted over to James Madison from the University of Pennsylvania, found a place where I could embody it through ecological practice, because ultimately I want to come back to therapy. I'm currently the president of the Society for Psychotherapy Integration. So in terms of my professional home, this how do we do psychotherapy and take the wisdom from all the schools of thought and try to create music out of them has been my long-term focus. How do I train combined integrated doctoral students? That's been my day job. So this is going on. And up until, I try to launch in several movements. I'm not good at launching movements. I'm a theorist. I'm a lone wolf. I'm trying to get people, I was like, I'm interested in ideas, getting all the logistics. I mean, I love hanging with people. I'm a clinician, but trying to organize people, trying to get them to do shit, trying to like, kind of like, well, you do this for me, I'll do this. I'm like, no, it's like, here's the thing. Okay. Yeah. So the system doesn't take off at all institutionally. All right. And I just get deeper and deeper into it. And ultimately, I have another series of insights which manifest themselves in the garden and the coin. Okay. So I'm building this, my first thing is, hey, problem of psychotherapy. Oh my God, there's a problem of psychology. I fall into justification and tree of knowledge. I then try to say, hey, this is a theoretical unification and it solves the problem of training professional psychologists. We can now know what psychological doctors are. And I can train you to be, and I can show, hey, I'm a director of this program. This is a really ecologically valid way of being a psychological doctor, blah, blah, blah. And I'm going to try to stay within the institution. In the interest of time, I'll skip over exactly what led to the insight. Well, I'll give you a quick little narrative. Yeah, 2016. 2016, I'm getting frustrated at this stage in the game. I'm building actually a movement toward a well-being initiative, okay? If you haven't heard, there's actually mental health problems going on.
Yes.
Okay?
Yeah.
Okay. And this post-COVID. Okay. We already knew in 2015. I documented the college student mental health crisis in 2013.
Right.
Okay.
So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So this is before COVID. We already knew the last 10 years have been a shit show for our child mental health. And oh my God, are we really seeing it now? Okay. But you could tell, and now COVID adds and everything else that's adding to it is just adding to it. So we knew we were in deep trouble. So I'm going to translate the system into the principles of well-being, define what well-being is, define what character development adaptation is, and then create an integrated model of psychological mindedness. This, by the way, gives rise to what is the left half of this tree here, and what will become. And at the time, it's the unified approach.
Sure.
I write my book on the unified theory, and then I jump over to unified approach and start building the actual process by which, okay, how do you translate this stuff into practice? That's what I wanted. That was my original thing. Still totally inside the academy. I'm at a conference, okay, and at this time, in terms of where I am, I'm both getting frustrated with it. I'm getting more and more out of my theory and more frustrated with the damn institution. It's like I'm further and further away, more and more clarity, and harder to speak to people.
Oh my God,
it's like,
so frustrating.
It's like I've got this fucking answer, and I'm getting the clearer my answer is, the further and further I'm away from people. And this then is going to then create an actual acceptance that this is exactly what's happening to me when I get to the garden. So I go to this conference on transformational education in March of 2016. I have my system called the UTOK system, UT, the unified theory, UA, unified approach. And instead it keeps saying the UT, UA, it collapsed itself into the UTOK system, okay? And so I was like, okay, here's the whole, I have to figure out how to share this whole system, blah, blah, blah. And it's, okay, so I'm emerging on a UTOK language. I'm at a conference called Cultivating the Globally Sustainable Self. I'll say that again, Cultivating the Globally Sustainable Self. Okay, pretty relevant for 21st century.
Yeah.
Great conference, brings in transformational educators, psychologists, and other thinkers together from across the globe, okay, to ask this question. I went to one excellent presentation after another, okay, except at the end. Okay. At the end, there was a panel discussion, and rather than where everybody's given their expertise, my friend who ran this, Craig Sheely at the time, who ran this, he had a panel, and he said, okay, bring it all together, folks. How do we learn from each other and cultivate a globally sustainable, what have we learned, and how can we consolidate it? And in my estimation, other people can have different opinions, of course, but my sitting there it was a shit show, okay? Everybody just said the same thing. You had a problem of psychology. Everyone's got their notions, and at some level they're very big and impressive, but when you actually put them together in relation, there is no bow tie, take the noise and turn it into music, especially if you were sitting from where I was sitting, okay? Mm-hmm. So I'm walking out of that with somebody, and I'm like, how was that? I was like, that was pretty confusing. I said, the damn answer, you want to know how to do this? You said, you plant a two of seeds and grow a two of trees. Okay, that's what I told them. That was my light bulb moment. Plant a two of seeds, the system, inside of our children, and grow them developmentally, okay? And create our kindergarten structures of education, where we are socializing them. If we want to be globally sustainable selves, we embed it in the educational architecture of our knowledge systems that are oriented toward wisdom. And we create it in an intergenerational network of planting seeds and growing trees. Okay. So that was, and it's like, so there it is. And then well, I should turn this thing into, this got to become a garden. Okay. Yeah. And then ultimately, so 2016, I set to work. There's a lot back here. It looks like a fucking cartoon, but it's a sincerely ironic cartoon. Embedded in this structure, okay, is a network of knowledge, framed in a garden where the tree of life, in its first branch, is the tree of knowledge, grounded to what's called the stepping stone, which is the standard theory of elementary particle physics. Step, okay? So yeah, it's that kind of thing. I'm like, what? Yeah, well, there are ways to take our theologies, mythic, poetic theologies, tree of knowledge, tree of life, gardens, right? Ground them in certain things. You could develop a whole nursery school around a kindergarten. Okay, that's actually where the term comes from. And then situate the ways in which you would actually evolve that so that we could move towards a much more sustainable self-globe relation.
Sure.
So that's basically what that is. And inside of that then is a layered, nested set of models that show how to take the academy and all of its threads of knowledge and root them together so that they maintain their integrity, but also, again, come together from noise to music. Okay? And see the right relation of the sciences, the natural and physical sciences, into the biological, social sciences, and then over to the humanities, and then inside a knowledge architecture that affords us the capacity to then build our citizens so they relate to the world in a way that's value and wisdom oriented.
Absolutely.
Which is, if you actually, what do we want to do with the academy? It's like, that's not a bad idea. You know,
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
actually, that's the original intent of the academy, as opposed to just produce people that sit in a capitalistic consumer structure and try to keep up with the Joneses, which is what we decided to do over the last 50 to 100 years, which may not be the best way to relate to each other or the planet. Okay?
Sure, absolutely. You got I
So-
agree. So would you like to maybe share some of the your visuals on the
Sure.
the tree of knowledge? I mean, I'd just love to at least give people a taste. I know it's a lot to unpack, especially for a first time. I mean, I would say I remember encountering the imagery, encountering your work for the first time. I remember thinking, I need multiple revisits to this in order to grok it. I mean, a lot of times something that's complex, you have to go back to. So, but now after many repeated, now it's really starting to cohere, and I'm getting it. It's coming together.
Good. Yeah, I'll certainly bring up a slide here in relation. Okay. Or a couple. All right. So just so folks can see, actually, I'll go back here and do this. Okay. So we can let me pull this up. I'll share my screen. Okay. Stop share. I don't know why that came up.
Well, while you're doing that, I'd love to just also just speak and plug your. You're also a writer, you're author on Psychology Today. You have articles that come out, and I've really enjoyed reading your articles, especially it was very succinct. Your 7 approaches to truth.
Okay.
I love that. I mean, my channel's name is The Truth.
Right.
So it's a topic that need to learn more about, to be honest. But you really do succinctly break down 7 different ways to approach it. And I'll link that in the description of this. And maybe, a couple other of, some of my favorite podcasts of yours were with like Layman Pascal and John Vervaeke and the guy, who was the Magnetic Zeros guy? I forget, Alex?
Oh, Alex Ebert? Sure.
Yeah, those are some of my favorite ones. So I'll link those in the description for folks to take a look at.
Okay. Yeah. So let me very quickly, some of the major forms of truth that we've already mentioned. One's a formal approach to truth. That's a formal logic, foundational, deductive approach. Okay. That's when you basically try to use logic, mathematics. Rene Descartes tries to do foundationalism in this regard, where he basically says, hey, I am therefore, I think therefore I am, and from there I can build foundational truths. So formal foundationalism, one version. You get a correspondent version, okay, which is what science is. I'm going to build a model. I'm going to test it empirically, okay? That's one version. Coherence is how do the parts interrelate, and do they sing, and are they intelligible to create a whole? I'm actually trying to bring back coherence. Coherence used to be really important, and then there were some problems with it was formulated, and it's very underdeveloped epistemologically now. And the UTOK is essentially coherence-oriented, although it's grounded in science and logic, so it's certainly not only coherence-oriented, okay? There's also things like pragmatism, social constructionism. There's axiological approaches, which are basic axiological meaning value, okay, based approaches about what is true. In relationship to just the basic now, so I built the garden thing, and then after the garden comes this thing called the coin, which I've alluded to, okay? And these 3 systems together can be thought of as really framing UTOK, okay? And then I can talk a little bit about the garden. And so over here, right behind me and right here, this is this garden that I'm talking about, and I can get into the specifics. Then you get the coin, and this, we've been talking about the tree of knowledge. Can't maybe see it right here, but this is justification between the mind animal and culture person, okay? So justification into the tree of knowledge, that's given me a scientific worldview, all right? Then I want to come back to a humanistic, scientifically grounded, but humanistically embedded view as a psychotherapist, okay? That then connects me to the professions and the humanities, and I build a scientific humanistic worldview, the UTUA framework, that through psychology and psychology's different branches, basic, human, and professional, you can now, with that being coherent, you can now build a whole knowledge system, okay? And that's what the garden then became, all right? So now that's like oriented towards a collective wisdom across scientific and humanistic considerations, okay? So it's grounded in science. In fact, that's what the stepping stone and the tree of knowledge do. The tree of knowledge is the first little thing here, but it also is a holistic frame. And then the final thing that I did, okay, which is exactly 5 years to go, relates directly to this. I'll tell you exactly. This is a 5-year anniversary.
My goodness.
Okay, today.
What?
is the emergence of the I-quad coin. Whoa. Okay, and the I-quad coin then is the referent for the specific, unique, qualitative knower, okay? So the tree of knowledge, the UTOK, is a metaphysical system. By that I mean it's the concepts and categories, okay, that afford us an onto-epistemology, that means a theory of reality and how we know about it, that's grounded in scientific, logical, subjective, and collective understanding. And it affords them these architectures for these particular points of view, which is, by the way, if you know anything about Ken Wilber, Ken Wilber got a lot of great insights by emphasizing the quadrants, which are emphasizing different, basically pronoun perspectives on the world. And a classic 3 pronouns, although quadrants have 4, the classic 3 are the I, this is how I see the world, Gregg and the world. The we, this is how me and Carlos and everybody else on the truth needs to come together to see the world. And then ultimately the it, this is how the world would look, whether you're a human or not, maybe, or at the very least from the most generalizable human knowledge perspective. And science, most people would argue, affords us the best view of the objective it as we try to factor out our human subjective and social knowing to leave behind what is logically left after we factor out ourselves. So what the UTOK does is it pulls together science, subject, and through these particular domains. So I was working from the scientific psychological side, Then I got into this bridge then back to the psychotherapy that landed me in a scientific humanistic philosophy that could cultivate a globally sustainable self. And ultimately, I also then found a way to connect the unique, idiographic, particular, qualitative knower to that position as well. And then that gives you a really nice, tight, set network of frameworks that go together to create a really whole, unified theory of knowledge.
Awesome. This is great. There's so many questions. I'm trying to figure out where to start and where to go. I would say one is, and for I think a really good playlist that you have is the Talk 101 playlist on your channel.
Yep.
Which I'll link in the description because it brings you through one by one each of the 8 branches of that tree, and I thought that was very insightful and a great way to kind of help grok the idea. May I ask who designs your diagrams? Do you put these together yourself?
Yes.
Oh, cool.
Whatever I am, I don't know. Sometimes it's like a quasi-artist, but
Sure.
inside my view, it's an art kind of thing. So yeah, there's certainly a creative expression element to it. I do all of them. And I totally acknowledge, and I've told people along this, you want to think about this as sort of version 1.0 for the UTOK. When this thing gets digested by the community, we're going to need graphic designers and everybody else that can speak to large numbers of people, then connect with them in the right design structure. So all this will need to be updated. But I needed to tie it together via this creative, expressive depiction. So yeah, all of this is my creation, even though it's from many angles, it's pretty clunky. I acknowledge that.
No, I mean, it's a start, like you said, version 1. And I think without the visual component, I don't know how you would start to figure this out. Or you have to put boundaries around things and visualize them. And it really helps because otherwise, if it was just a dialogue of these concepts and ideas, I would never get there. Yeah. I mean, personally speaking, yeah.
This, again, to use a Wilbur term, this is a vision logic sort of relation. Okay, so I'm pulling on your primate capacity to perceive the world via what something Jill Neffrey calls natural intelligence, as well as your propositional network. And the tying of those together affords us a lot to move a lot faster ultimately. Although much about science, although of course you use a lot of graphs and stuff, but too much is suggestive that you can just achieve it through propositional deductive analysis for sure.
Gotcha. And you have a tree, you have a garden. My question, where's the serpent? Where's the
lovely
snake element?
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
Here.
So if in the full version that I laid out called UTOK 20, there is a thing that sits behind the garden. So a lot of people are like, oh, you're oriented toward wisdom, and what are you, some utopian, and we're all just gonna be enlightened and have joy and love in our hearts and see truth, goodness, and beauty everywhere. And that's what you're saying. And I'm like, that's not what I'm saying. Okay. All right. So just to give you a framework for where I come from, for 4 years I worked with Beck. My primary job was helping coordinate the suicide attempter project. Okay. Mm-hmm. You had to have made a suicide attempter to get in. We brought in 180 people to this project. Okay. I've sat under a bridge with a heroin addict who had tried to kill herself 30 times, who gave $5 blowjobs to homeless men to get her heroin addiction fixed.
Jesus.
Okay. So the world can suck. Okay. And it will suck for many, many people. Inevitably, and I'm sorry. All right, and we're all gonna die. Okay, so this thing is a light out of the tunnel of suffering that you find yourself if you're a clinician. Especially if you work with severe mental illness. But all clinicians will face this pretty regularly. And suicide's going through the roof. So everyone I talk to is like, oh, we got suicide problems. Okay. But anyway, so there's a hell of a lot of suffering going on. So the question is, hey, is this utopia? The question is, can we do better? Okay. Can we get a clue of our knowledge systems and get some degree of coherence on the big questions and then do better in terms of wisdom? And this is the orienting structure toward wisdom. Okay. Now to get to your question, when you do the whole I'll put up a UTOK 20, okay, which really goes through the core problems of this thing and all the different pieces in its fullest form. And there's a thing called the dragon's lair. Okay,
right, I've seen that, sure.
Okay.
I've seen it.
So the dragon's lair sits behind the garden. And it's a picture of a shadow dragon. Okay, that's a reference, of course, to your underlying unconscious. All right, chained to what are called a triple negative neurotic loop, which relates to the maladaptive processes of thinking, feeling, relating, and behaving. Okay, that then trap people in the cave of behavioral shutdown, which is the felt sense of hopelessness and darkness, and there's no goddamn where to go in the world, underneath the personality disorder star, which is the broken identity, affective relationship structures that abused and dysfunctional people both have inside themselves and then perpetrate on the world and get perpetrated back to them in the maladaptive interpersonal structure. Okay? So behind this thing is a cave of behavioral shutdown that far too many people are living in. Okay, that is my frame for depression. It's called the behavioral shutdown model. Okay, we talk about what depression is in that regard. And so the suffering of your tying to your shadow, I am not this, I need to be this, what the hell's going on? Okay, relative to who treats me bad or what's wrong with me, and think about the avoidant client I talked about and all the other horrible ways in which the world you can find yourself in the world, okay? And this focuses, in particular, I will say, it's a model of psychopathology, so there are lots of ways to find yourself in hell. You could be on a train to Auschwitz and just watching a World War II series, a lot of ways to find yourself in hell. This is the psychological neurotic personality disorder path to hell, which this highlights, okay? Which is its own hell, for sure. So that's one aspect of the garden that relates to a key aspect of human experience, very relevant, and is the equivalent of the serpent and the dangers that we face in relation.
Got it. So it's behind the garden. Yep, and I've seen that as well. And you have one of the things I think is interesting, the elephant sun god, which I believe sits at the top. And is there a relationship to Ganesha?
Yep.
Okay, so is that the reason why? I'd love to hear.
Well, so I should be clear about this. Okay, so I get raised as an atheist in the Dawkins sense. Okay. Without a belief in God, and then I thought that, and I was handed this simplistic dichotomy. If you follow John Vervaeke, you know he's a nun or non-theism. Which he points to as the simplistic dichotomy of, is God a real ontological thing that you know and can specify as a personal God, and you know what its attributes are, and you have a specific relationship, and you can know it like you know your wife, okay? Mm-hmm. That's a concrete theism. Or is God like Santa Claus, and Santa Claus doesn't exist, God doesn't exist, people are confused, and they believe that there's a real concrete God, and they're just wrong. This is what simplistic theism versus atheism is, and this is the debate I actually got grown up with my house, in the sense that my dad, who was raised sort of moderate Methodist, had a Billy Graham conversion in his young adult, became evangelical because of the concrete reality of Christ and the literal person that was Christ and who was literally resurrected, okay, and then becomes resurrected into the world. And that's why my dad believed in the world that he did, okay?
Sure, got it.
And so then you have this whole structure where it's like, then he becomes a history professor where he's like, oh, that was actually wrong. I don't believe that anymore. I have faith in that. I lose my faith. I don't think it's true. And I think God's like Santa Claus. So we get raised in relationship to this.
Yeah.
So I'm an atheist without belief in God. I'm an agnostic atheist because I'm not a foundationalist. I hate foundationalism in many regards. Well, at least certain aspects of it. Fundamentalism, I should say, in this case, where you know what the truth is. I don't know what the truth is. Like, God only knows, I like to used to say. And that made me an agnostic atheist, which I don't know what the fundamental universe is. I'm going to look for the best epistemological systems. Physics, to me, was the best epistemological system, although I'm much more inclined these days to mysticism as well as certainly leading to certain key insights.
Yeah, sure,
but at the time, I'm thinking more in terms of physics. Now I'd say physics and mysticism and a lot of stuff pointing. But anyway, that was my frame. And so I'm an agnostic atheist. Then I come across this concept through my friend Alexander Bard called syntheism, which is the God you create. Okay, syntheism is the God you create. And then I was like, oh my God, yeah. And ultimately, I like to say now, of course, I have a list of a UTOK credo. One of my UTOK credo is I believe in the concept of God. It's part of my credo. Okay. And it makes two claims. The first one is not terribly radical, and that is people believe in God and that has consequences. So I believe in the concept of God. I've seen it. People definitely do believe in God, and that has significant consequences for how they operate in the world. So that's a radical statement. I know, Carlos, I'm blowing your mind now. And then I believe in it in the way that the new atheists don't. That's what I mean also. In other words, I'm invested in the potential of the concept of God to be valuable. Okay?
Got it.
Like the concept of God can be a useful concept. Okay?
On board with that. Yeah.
So for me, then what I stumbled upon as something rising above the garden, okay, so the garden is oriented toward wisdom and light and the potential for our human transcendence. And I learned that the proper framing for God is that which orients you towards the transcendent. That's what God is.
Yes.
Okay. It's like, well, I definitely feel oriented at times toward the transcendent and less times, other times. Okay.
Yeah, we're all human.
There you go.
Yeah.
And that's like, well, I can see that. I believe in that. And then what is that? And then how do we relate to that? Okay. And so that's then the question. And so I developed an icon that could rise over the garden. In some ways sometimes I put it in the garden, but often it's really separate. The garden is my particular path to see God. There would be lots of other possible pluralistic paths, but this is a coherent, integrated idea of the concept of God, which means many people have achieved paths to wisdom that allow them to put themselves in relationship to the ultimate. The garden is one path. Hindu, Buddhism, any other number of things that have a lot more grounding than my goddamn little garden. But for me, it's the garden. And then now as it trajects, of course, to the Judeo-Christian particular tradition, because that's where I'm actually embedded in the West and in science. So then what is the elephant sun god? The elephant sun god came to me it's a collection of these concepts. First, it's a reference to Ra in general, the Egyptian god Ra. Yeah. Okay? And the idea that so many of the major traditional religions identify God as a particular source of light and power, surprisingly enough.
Absolutely,
right? That's the sun. Okay. So anyway, it's a reference in particular to a Bronze Age religion god, sitting in the Middle East. And then I reach across the earth to then pull Ganesha out of that because I'm sitting here as an agnostic atheist scientist. And what I want to try to get the image of is I'm going to see a Bronze Age god come across the sun and also pull then the Ganesha god of good fortune and wisdom and intellect, through that, and then create a triangulating relationship between God itself rising above the horizon. Me, I don't know anything about Hinduism, So for all of Hinduism, I'm clueless. I'm sorry, I love you. But I know enough, and I know enough about Ganesha, and I know enough about the basic Hindu structure that I don't know what I'm talking about, but I know enough, and then I researched Ganesha. The connection to Ganesha was interesting because to me, then goes back into my first chapter in my 2011 book, A New Unified Theory of Psychology, is From Racing Horses to Seeing the Elephant. And I use the old Indian John Godfrey Sachs poem on 5 or 6 blind men come across an elephant. Each grabs a part of it.
Yes, that's wonderful. Yeah.
So and in fact, actually, I'll turn this up just a little bit. There's a little tiny picture, and I can pull up that right there is the elephant sun god. It's a little picture of it. I can pull up a clearer picture of it. But basically, you'll see in the version I give, at least, what you find is that it is a picture of that John Godfrey Sachs elephant. On a sun. So that's me in my science seeing the whole, having good fortune, overcoming some obstacles, seeing wisdom and intellect, shining through a light that traditional societies have seen across the ages and built justification systems to be oriented around. So that's the elephant sun god, and it's my icon for the concept of God.
God, I love it. Yeah, it's wonderful. And one thing a question I had, I know we're coming up on the end here, but I'm not sure which podcast, which interview this was with, but I did write down that you said you had felt the overmind and light from supermind.
Yeah.
Would you mind?
Yeah. So anyway, this is a connection that I made to Aurobindo's work. He's a Sri Aurobindo, is a great Indian psychologist and thinker and spiritual person, and he wrote a book called A Greater Psychology. Okay, so he gets introduced to Western psychology. Is somewhat interested in it, but is also like, you guys don't know. We've been doing this a lot longer. Okay, and by the way, the whole point of yogi science is to start with the inner. Okay, so yogi science is fundamentally doesn't do the third person empiricism by any stretch. So it's fascinating to have two totally different epistemological structures. I have an interesting history with the book. I found the book, started it. This was maybe 2010 or whatever. I don't remember when it was actually published, but I was like, oh, what is this? I'm always looking for psychology. Open it up and like, it's all this non-scientific stuff.
Yeah.
That was my first reaction. My first reaction to Wilbur, by the way. I understand better now, but that's what I was raised. That was my initial culture. So then I put it down. I then am talking with Zach Stein and a few other people and getting oriented, and several people are mentioning Aurobindo, your system actually sounds a little bit like Aurobindo in the way you're elevating into the garden and elevating into structures that I had some transcendent experiences that I encapsulated what's called wisdom energy. Anyway, but then I went back to this book, A Greater Psychology, and I was like, oh, it's like, oh, you mean... And then he's identifying my animal self, okay? And then he's identifying my egoic mind. And then he's getting into transpersonal, use some other language, but cross-person egoic mind. And then you're getting higher and higher visions of unity as your local position in the world expands and your capacity to be perspectively at one with the whole universe is growing as you become centered. And so what you get a Ken Wilber experience would be what I was like, a wisdom energy. Energy is down and back to Big Bang, and wisdom's up to God. I experienced a wisdom energy alignment across the stack so that I was in touch with God as I was in touch with Big Bang, and my psyche was fundamentally, and down to my cells, were fundamentally aligned and singing the same song. I had this like a 2-week period of transcendent wisdom energy. And I was just wandering around going like, dude, yep, this is the way it should be.
When was it? What did it feel like? I mean,
it's funny, and we should wrap up here because I will go in a little bit, and I can come back possibly, a few other things. So actually, I should end on this. So I did the garden, 2016. The next year, I'm trying to connect the garden as a belief system that then I have to the rest of the world, okay? Mm-hmm. And then I then stumble across what's called the I-quad path, okay? The I-quad path is what, remember I said I don't really like formal systems. I built what I would consider to be a formal, logical, stepwise system that creates a network, a metaphysical justificatory network between my belief system and the rest of the world that creates an architecture that then contains all belief in relation. Okay? All right? So anyway, what is the I-quad path? It's actually kind of simple at first. It looks stupidly simple. The first thing is I-quad equals 1, which also equals I to the 4th. Okay, that's actually becomes on the little symbol. I is the imaginary number. You square that, you get -1. You square it again, you get 1. I to the 4th equals 1. That's a logical foundational relation.
Yep. Oh yeah.
And it's obviously, and then it's nominal in the sense that I'm naming that I-quad. Okay, so it's a nominal deductive relation.
Sure.
I then assign that to next to another nominal deductive relation called the Euler identity. Okay, the Euler identity is e to the pi I plus 1 equals 0. Okay,
beautiful equation.
And indeed the third step is empirically, as of now, the Euler identity is objectively the most beautiful mathematical equation that there is. That's the third step in the I-quad path. Okay. And it just means that when you survey mathematicians, almost always you get the Euler identity winning. There are some physics equations, Dirac equation, for example, inside physicists that they say that's more beautiful. But I'm saying mathematicians, you take mathematicians and you take mathematics, it wins. So it's the most objectively beautiful. Notice these are very interesting justifications. Now they're nominal, deductive, and then an empirical, logical, psychological claim about mathematics and beauty. Okay,
Sure.
that are now. So now this creates what I call an exterior network of justification. Okay,
Okay.
which is just okay. You have to know these three things. And then I do the fourth step. Okay, the fourth step transforms the e to the pi I plus 1, and it substitutes 1, okay, for what I call the Henriques equivalency, which is 2 pi I f. Okay, and it's called, so 2 pi I f equal, and in 2001 I derived the Henriques equivalency. It equals to 1. 2 pi I f equals 1. Although how I derive it, I can't get into. Okay.
Sure.
But we'll say, and so I substitute that, and to me then, in my subjective experience of being, e to the pi I plus 2 pi I f equals 0 is subjectively true and beautiful.
Huh. Okay.
Okay?
All right.
All right? And then the final thing that I did with the I quad coin is I looped the fourth step back to the first, okay, and created an equivalency with I quad with all human identity, okay? Mm-hmm. And ultimately what that does is it creates a looping network whereby you have deductive nominal truths about certain empirical claims pertaining to beauty, objectively, then there's a subjective beauty claim. Ultimately, this 2 pi IF thing actually drops into physics, and you create a network between subjective, objective, beauty, truth, and goodness that then collapses back to the I quad coin and says, well, now each of us can place ourselves in the human identity network, because then the 1 to the I to the fourth becomes the human identity function. So I'd have to explain some of that, but the bottom line is that basically creates a network gestalt of associative adjacent identities that tie together physics, aesthetics and value, subjective, objective, nominal, and deductive claims all into a network architecture that pops like a gestalt. And then when you have this, then you can say, well, that's fucking bullshit. That 2 pi IF thing, that doesn't work. I was like, that's a totally good subjective position of justification. I call it the anti-equivalency. Okay? So now I'm taking a pro-equivalency and you're taking an anti-equivalency, but we can then go to the 3 exterior truths of I quad, of the other, and then I can then show you the network about why I do this. And then as you learn about why I substitute both 1 for I quad and the human identity function and 1 for 2 pi IF, you get opened up into a network, which is what you've just been living in, that you have to say, I can at least see why you think that's subjectively true and beautiful. Because it does all this.
Oh my God.
Okay?
Okay, yeah.
Okay. So now you have an entire field network of justification that includes the pro and anti, all networked together with subjective, objective, logic, nominal, and all the various truth claims, okay? Together, tied together in a coherent, I told you about the coherence, a coherent system that places the parts in relationship to the whole, that takes the noise and turns it into music.
Wow. Well, I need time with that one, to be honest.
So there you go. That's fine. The I quad path,
Yeah.
I'll finalize it here. So 5 years ago to this day, at noon, I finished my I quad path. Okay. I went out and kicked my son's ass in tennis. Yes, John, I'm talking to you. And that was very rare because I normally, and that's one of the few, we had about 3 more months of playing until it was just so embarrassing every time I'd go out. But I was hypomanic, just sort of like I am now in this tone. And I went out there and I finished that task and I found the I quad path. And I put the exclamation point, which is, by the way, an I turned upside down. I put the exclamation point on, yes, I think in weird ways. I put the exclamation point on my structure. And voila, here we are at the end of a nice little ride.
What a ride it was. Gregg, thank you so much for this lovely conversation. I mean, I think there's so many, I have so many more questions, but of course your time, we're wrapping up here. From the bottom of my heart, I appreciate your time, passion, and energy. And is there anything you want to sort of encapsulate, anything you want to say, or how can people find out more about you? What's the best way for people
certainly. I'll send you some links. Actually, I want to announce I'm doing a UTOK workshop. I'll send you a link to that. We're trying to build, we want a fairly small group, but if folks are interested, they can reach out to me. We are charging a little bit for it, but I'll send you the flyer on that. I'll give you my homepage, which we're about ready to update, and a few other links that we talked about. But yeah, you can, if you Google Gregg Henriques, stuff comes up, and
Yeah,
I'm free with my email, so anyone can reach out to that.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And I'll link below in the description all of your outlinks, and
Lovely.
Highly recommend people check you out. Thanks to you again, Greg. Really appreciate it.
Hey, man, I really appreciate it. It's a lovely interview. Made my day, and I deeply appreciate the opportunity to share what has been an interesting rabbit hole that I fell into.
Wonderful. Thanks again.
All right, man. Take care.